Good afternoon and welcome to our members and our guests. I'm Scott Charney. I'm Vice Chair of the NSTAC, the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. Thank you for taking time to be here today for the November 2018 NSTAC meeting. It's a pleasure to see everyone in the room, and I believe we're also webcasting as well. I'd also like to recognize several of our distinguished government partners participating today, including Mr. Grant Schneider, Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council, and Undersecretary Christopher Krebs, National Protection and Programs Directorate, or NPPD. I'd like to also welcome Chancellor Patrick Gallagher from the University of Pittsburgh. We're all waiting for that name change, okay? Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to your contributions. The NSTAC last met in August via conference call. During that meeting, we received our tasking to examine advancing resiliency and fostering innovation in the ICT ecosystem. Additionally, Mr. Krebs discussed DHS's National Cybersecurity Summit, as well as the National Risk Management Center. For today, we have several key items on our agenda. As our first order of business, we will receive an update on U.S. government priorities from Mr. Schneider and Mr. Krebs. Next, the Cybersecurity Moonshot Subcommittee's co-chairs, Mr. Peter Altabef and Mr. Mark McLaughlin, will discuss the draft NSTAC report to the President on a cybersecurity moonshot. Then NSTAC members will have the opportunity to deliberate and vote on the report. Following the deliberation and vote, we will receive a keynote address from Chancellor Gallagher. We will then complete the afternoon by receiving an update on the Advancing Resiliency and Fostering Innovation in the ICT Ecosystem Subcommittee from the Subcommittee Chair, Mr. David DeWalt. Thank you again for attending today's meeting. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mr. Schneider to discuss some of the administration's priorities. Mr. Schneider.
Scott, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for being here today. Definitely appreciate the work of the committee and all the effort that has gone into the Moonshot report that we're going to hear about later. Certainly excited to be able to start getting that integrated into or really a part of some of the priorities we have. In September, the administration put out our first national cyber strategy in 15 years. And so I want to touch a little bit on it because it really highlights a variety of the priorities we have for cybersecurity. And the National Cyber Strategy is focused and built around the National Security Strategy and the 4 pillars of the National Security Strategy. And the first pillar is protecting the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. And there's 2 main areas I want to touch on under Pillar 1. First of all is federal cybersecurity. So obviously a high priority for the government is our focus on protecting the systems and the information that we hold and house on behalf of the American people, all the services that we provide from the government to citizens as well. And so, and how are we serving and having the government serve as an example of what good cybersecurity looks like. So we should be and will be holding ourselves to the same level of expectations and requirements that we are private industry, whether we hold industry accountable through regulations or through just what our expectations are. We should be holding ourselves to at least that same level going forward. Second area under Pillar 1 that I want to talk about is critical infrastructure. Obviously, our critical infrastructure is absolutely important to the American way of life. It is important to our government functions. It's important to our industry functions. And we have to look at, are we bringing all of the government capabilities to bear in this sector? Are we doing everything that we think we should be doing? And what are innovative ways that we can better protect our critical infrastructure? Because those dependencies are just too important, again, for the level of interconnectedness that we have in our environment and in our country today. The second pillar is promoting American prosperity. So this starts to get into the fact that America built the internet, we brought the internet to the world. It has been an engine of innovation, right? It has driven a lot of the companies who have memberships, members of NSTAC and others really driven innovation and driven a lot of economic prosperity for our nation, and we need to continue that going forward. One of the key elements of that is what our workforce looks like. And so workforce is a very important part of our strategy. And it's not just the workforce of people who are doing information technology or cybersecurity positions, but how are we getting the entire ecosystem of the workforce to be cyber aware, to understand their role in cybersecurity, whether they're an entry-level person at a commercial company or somewhere in the federal government, or they're at a C-suite or secretary level, to be able to understand what role they play, understand what risk management looks like. We were very focused on taking a risk management approach and how we can drive and really build the workforce of the future that industry can recruit from and that the government can recruit from as well going forward. The third pillar is preserving peace through strength. And this starts to get into how do we make cyber an element of national power? How do we start to view cyber not as this one-off thing where we, fight cyber with cyber, or that we use it and think of cyber as a tool only in the cyber realm, or even how we set consequences for others who have malicious behavior in cyber or perform malicious activity in cyberspace. Doesn't necessarily need to be a cyber tool that we react with. We have lots of different tools, lots of different levers of national power. Cyber is one of those, both from a defensive standpoint and from an offensive standpoint, if you will. Shortly before we put the National Cyber Strategy out, we rescinded Presidential Policy Directive 20, which governed offensive cyber operations for our country, and we put in place a far more streamlined and more agile governance process because we want to be sure that offensive cyber capabilities are available to us when necessary, when we think that that is the appropriate response that we want to use, or that that is going to drive an outcome that we are looking to achieve. The fourth pillar is advancing American influence. So how are we working with our like-minded partners internationally? How are we building coalitions, establishing what we think are norms of behavior, acceptable norms of behavior inside of cyberspace, and how we do consequence management for those that would behave badly or behave against those norms, if you will. One of the underlying tenets of the strategy, and when people ask me, read our national cyber strategy and say a lot of the priority actions in here are familiar. They're things that we've known we need to do. And in fact, they are things. I think in cybersecurity, there's a lot of we need to do basic things really well, and we need to do them over and over again. So there is a lot of consistency of what we've seen in the past. But really, the shift in our strategy is a movement from process and policy to action and accountability. So we are really focused on what are the actions, the priority actions in the strategy. We are developing an implementation plan for the National Cyber Strategy internal to the government. That won't be a publicly available document because A, we don't want to let adversaries know what our implementation plans are, and we want to be able to leverage ongoing activities. And so all the implementation efforts for the National Cyber Strategy are not necessarily new. Some of them are things that have been underway based on taskings from Executive Order 13800 or other efforts that we've had in flight. And then the other piece, action and accountability, is really how are we holding everyone accountable. This is internal to the federal government. It's our senior leadership. Individual agencies are held accountable for their cybersecurity, but it also goes to what are we doing to hold industry accountable. Everyone's got a role to play. How do we hold people accountable in that space? And then finally, how are we holding our adversaries or potential or actual malicious actors accountable in cyberspace as well? And so you've seen in the last year and a half numerous sanctions, numerous indictments, some convictions, some actual extraditions as well, and getting some malicious actors in front of federal judges. That's not the only way that an indictment drives behavior change, but it is certainly one that's very helpful. So we are looking again at what are all the different tools we can bring to bear in this space. And reading through the draft moonshot report to the president, I think a lot of the areas there tie very, very neatly. I think actually all of them are encompassed in some way, shape, or form with the National Cyber Strategy. As we're developing our implementation plan for the National Cyber Strategy, I think we've got a really good opportunity, and the timing really is perfect for us to be able to take what's in the moonshot, make sure that we've got implementation efforts for it as we look at the broader governance piece that you guys have pulled together and the recommendations there on kind of how do we drive this whole of government and in reality whole of nation approach to moving our cybersecurity posture forward. So we're really excited about the opportunities that we have in front of us right now. Very excited about the work that the NSTAC has done. Very appreciative of the time and effort that's gone into this report. Thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to invite Mr. Krebs to discuss some of DHS's priorities. Chris?
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, since I came in March 2017, I had one top-line priority, and that was to change the name of my organization. And we're that close. The House passed HR.
So you're leaving next month?
Small things build into big things. So we're on the cusp of achieving that objective. Just last evening, the House passed by unanimous consent HR 3359, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act. Hopefully, we'll get that signed by the president this week, and then that starts a transition and progression from NPPD, which I guarantee maybe two people, not counting the people that work for me in this room, know what that means, to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. That gets us a few things. One is it's a name that very effectively tells people what it is we do and doesn't sound, I made this joke before, but doesn't sound like a Soviet-era military intelligence branch, NKVD or whatever. But it also streamlines the organization. We have some subcomponents that aren't directly linked to infrastructure or risk management related activities, transitions them into other mission support areas of the department, but also helps branding. It helps with recruiting, going to a talent fair or a job fair and say, hey, come work for NPPD. It doesn't work. NSA has a lot better success using their brand. So, but most importantly, it puts us on the level of other operational agencies within the federal government, including within the department, TSA, FEMA. It does create an operational agency effect that will help as we are able to engage and cements our position as the lead civilian agency for cybersecurity. So with that in mind, over the course of the last several months, I believe since the last NSTAC meeting, DHS has issued a cybersecurity strategy in addition to the national strategy. That DHS strategy really represents a number of the organizational priorities for NPPD, soon to be CISA, and it's built similarly around a pillar approach, and it had five pillars. One is understand risk. We need to understand what it is that we're protecting, that we're increasing the security around. Some of the things that Dave will be doing in the next committee effort, but also reducing threats. That is not as much my space. That is Secret Service. That is ICE, Homeland Security Investigations. That's cyber crime and cyber-enabled crime. Reduce vulnerabilities. That's very much what we're doing with our technical alerts and some of the information sharing around operational threats, the operational threat environment. Mitigating consequences. That is in part what we're talking about here in the cybersecurity moonshot. It's getting to a more secure and resilient ecosystem. And then lastly is enabling better cybersecurity outcomes, and in part, that is the workforce challenge. what is the solution down the road? Is it hiring more people into government? Is it hiring more people into industry? Better automation? These are the questions that we are trying to work through right now. You know, my personal opinion is we're not going to be able to fill all those available billets we have across the federal government, much like you're probably not going to be able to fill all your billets. So what is that collective approach? What is that collective defense model? The approach that we're taking to work through those pillars of the DHS strategy and CISA, when it comes out, will have basically it's, as we shift to CISA, this is a ribbon cutting. I'm sorry, this is a groundbreaking, not a ribbon cutting. We have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of this operationalization. There are obviously some legal issues that have to be taken care of, from management directives and delegations of authorities, bureaucracy pieces within the department. But organizationally, I kind of equate us to a 14-year-old startup. You know, we don't have the mature processes in place, so we've got a lot of internal work to do. But we have a very clear sense of purpose, and we're taking the approach to cybersecurity and working with the critical infrastructure community with a few different principles in mind. First is that we will take a risk-informed approach. We have to focus scarce resources on the most challenging problems. Second, we're going to be transparent. We're going to be transparent about the threat, and we're going to be transparent about what we're doing to address the threat. Just having come through the midterm elections piece, we were very visible. We were very vocal in our partnerships with state and local election officials, and we were sharing the various things we were doing across the country. We're also going to be stakeholder-driven, and what I mean by that is, as a voluntary organization, my regulatory authorities are very, very limited to chemical security, but not in a general cybersecurity sense. We, based on this voluntary public-private partnership, in order for that to be successful, I need my stakeholders to tell us what they need us to do. We're not going to be the good idea shop. We need folks to bring their problems to us that we can work on collectively, and then build that requirement set and drive a demand signal that we will orientate our activities around. And lastly, whatever it is that we do, it has to be value added. If we're not solving a problem, we need to go find another job to do. And as a part of that, as a part of the value add, we're not supplanting market solutions. We do in part look for market failures, but we need to find the places where as a government we have unique contributions and ability to solve a problem. So in terms of more tactical priorities or focus priorities, we will continue to drive into the federal network security space, working closely with our partners from OMB. We're probably best known for our binding operational directives, the Kaspersky Labs BOD from last year. We will continue to use binding operational directives as measures to improve security across the networks. We have found that tool through FISMA 2014 to be highly effective in changing behaviors and security posture across the federal government. We will continue to drive in that space, but at the same time, offering those baseline security capabilities through the National Cyber Protection System and the continuous diagnostic and mitigation platforms, and continue to push capabilities out into the agencies. More broadly, in the critical infrastructure space, we will expand into the industrial control system area. Lots of room for growth there. It's still a relatively immature risk space that we have established a number of pilots, including just launching recently the Pipeline Cybersecurity Initiative. We're partnering with the Department of Energy and the Transportation Security Administration and a number of pipeline companies to provide focused assessments on cybersecurity risk to pipelines across the country. We will also be moving into the supply chain security space, the supply chain risk management space. Just a couple weeks ago, we established the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. We have the first kickoff meeting tomorrow here in DC. That has turned out to be quite a popular task force. We've got well over 60 members, I believe. But that is a recognition of a significant area of interest across industry and government, and understanding that it's going to take a collective approach to solve the risk management challenges there. And then lastly, move into a space that DHS, with this cybersecurity agency mantle, has not really taken advantage of historically, but is more public awareness. What can we do to, in part through the transparency piece, what can we do to better educate the American public on cybersecurity risks and what they can do to protect themselves? I've said this before, I said it downstairs. The National Cybersecurity Center in the United Kingdom has done a admirable job of communicating risks and simple steps that companies, small businesses, and the average home user or consumer can do to secure themselves. So we will also be exploring ways that we can increase public awareness. And lastly, we're adopting kind of an organizational principle of defend today and secure tomorrow. And what that means is, from an operational perspective, the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, will remain the operational, the tactical center of gravity, day-to-day, 24/7 cybersecurity threat indicator sharing, incident response, federal network monitoring and protection, really getting to the meaty part of cybersecurity today. But at the same time, we have to be thinking down the road, and that's precisely what the Cybersecurity Moonshot contemplates. That's what reports like MITRE's Delivered Uncompromised report works through. What are the strategic steps that we need to take, those strategic efforts that we'll get tomorrow and the next years and 5 years out to ensure that the security defense challenges we have today, we don't have 5 years from now? But to be clear, we will always be defending today, securing tomorrow, because even 5 years from now, the adversary will have shifted, and we will be fighting a different battle. So we are trying to introduce this construct of the warfighter today and the strategy to ensure that the next deployment or the next generation of infrastructure is secure against today's threats. So with that, that's kind of where we are in terms of DHS.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So I am going to modify the agenda slightly. As I said earlier, our next item of business was going to be the cybersecurity moonshot. But in fact, I'm going to ask Chancellor Gallagher to offer his remarks now. The reason for this change is that we do have a quorum here. We have enough members, but we have some members who want to dial in for the moonshot vote. And that is scheduled for 2 o'clock. So my plan is to turn the microphone over to the Chancellor for his remarks, and then depending on when he's done, we might go to Dave DeWalt to talk about the resiliency effort. And then at 2 o'clock, we'll move directly to the moonshot and the vote. Okay? Chancellor.
Somebody else to get ready. But I'm happy to play this role. I confess to being a little surprised when I got the invitation to attend this meeting. It's always an honor. NSTAC is, one of our most important federal advisory committees. But I was actually surprised even the first time when I was asked to appear before the Moonshot Group, because I'm not, a cyber expert per se, although I worked at NIST for 21 years, and so there's some osmosis that happened, but I wouldn't put myself in this category. My remarks to the Moonshot Group really centered around the question of their charge and how difficult a charge that was, and specifically, what is a moonshot, and what are the sort of the core elements to moonshots. And I think since we're on the verge of perhaps endorsing it from the committee, one way to summarize this might be, does cyberspace have a moon? And so I wanted to sort of share some of the comments I'd made to the Moonshot Group and sort of reflect a little bit on how I think that plays out in the draft report. So moonshot terminology has been kind of widely adopted. Google X and others now, kind of almost branded this. There's kind of this idea of moonshot thinking, which is a much more general idea, sort of, big idea, high risk, high payoff kind of thinking. But the moonshot itself is a template for a type of federal effort that is actually fairly rare. The Apollo program, the moonshot, stemmed from a critical national security issue, namely Sputnik. And the policy motivation behind that program was less about getting a man safely to the moon and back as it was about addressing a perceived gap in space superiority between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the first thing to note about a moonshot is that they typically come from a big crisis, and the policy objective is not the same thing as the project objective of the moonshot itself, but they reinforce each other. Two other examples come to mind that I think there's actually several, but they are fairly rare. The Manhattan Project actually, is the antecedent to that, and that was certainly a moonshot in many respects, although a classified one that was seeking to change the strategic landscape of the Second World War by looking at the possibility of fission explosive device. And a more recent one, sort of post-moonshot example, was President Reagan's Star Wars initiative, which again sought to change the strategic landscape regarding ballistic missiles by looking at a technology that could intercept and destroy those. So another characteristic in my mind of moonshots is that one of the things you see in all of them is, even though the policy environment is very complex, the moonshots themselves tend to be very specific, almost engineering type challenges towards an objective that, if successful, would strategically change the landscape. So they are that Hail Mary pass. They are, this effort of really looking for a game changer. Some of them have succeeded. It's clearly the Manhattan Project and the Apollo programs did. And I would say some have been less immediately successful in terms of reaching their stated objective, but they were very successful in the context of mobilizing very considerable efforts towards that direction. So this idea of a separation policy and having a very clear moonshot objective that has, in other words, spillover effects in terms of your degree of mobilizing a workforce, moving a technology space forward, things of that type are, in my mind, the real characteristics. And so that's why I think they're rare. And the challenge, to compare with other government-related efforts, a moonshot is not the only tool in the arsenal. And I think, this committee knows that. There are all sorts of tools the government can use to address major policy objectives, including direct government action, whether military, law enforcement, regulatory, but also in areas like legislative response, changing the business conditions, liability, tax structure, cost incentives, and also through leadership, there's a powerful convening role. Many of the international efforts looking at norms of behavior, international treaties, agreements, standard efforts, regulatory harmonization, these kind of efforts are also very powerful and all in the arsenal, if you will, of things we look at. And if you look at many of the things that we've casually thrown moonshot language around, war on cancer and other things, they actually don't fit into the classic moonshot. They're just kind of moonshot banners that we put on what are really much more traditional government efforts, like dramatic increases in funding, things of that type. The other thing I told the moonshot group was I thought the charge letter given to DHS and to NSTAC was a hard one, and I think everyone knows that. I think that there's a couple reasons for that. One is, for anyone who's worked hard in cybersecurity, and that's probably everybody in this room, you reach this conclusion very rapidly that the moonshot is not a get-out-of-jail card. that there is no shiny technical answer that's going to solve all of the problems that we face. There is no free lunch in cybersecurity. And I think that's why the document wisely has a multi-pillared, very much like the strategic plans at the federal level and the DHS level, a multi-pillared kind of all of everybody set of strategies. The policy environment lends itself to this, you got to sweat out all the details. It's about getting more things right than wrong, and it's about the hard work of closing vulnerabilities and addressing gaps, and certainly we can do much better than we have, I think, both in terms of focusing our efforts in a risk-based way, but also in moving much faster. I think the real problem in cyber has been velocity. It's just too, we're talking about things that we were talking about 10 years ago, I hate to say. When you're dealing with an environment that is as asymmetric as cyber environment, where a few bad actors can get things done very quickly, and we have to mobilize all of government, all of country, all of world type responses, you can see that velocity is one of these intrinsic problems. So in my mind, cyber generically does not lend itself to moonshot thinking in the government sort of Apollo kind of program, because I don't think there is a silver lining to the problem. But I think the answer lies in, and I think the report bears this out, that what you can do is separate this policy objective from the moonshot. And I think in the moonshot report, these are called moonshot grand challenges now. There is room for a very focused, within government type of mobilization. So you got to actually pick something that the government can mobilize on, either by funding to encourage it or by doing it directly. That while it would not solve creating a secure internet for all by 2028 or whatever the policy objective is, would have a significant effect in both a very important technical direction, but also in mobilizing technology, R&D efforts, increasing the workforce, increasing attention, and we ended up having a very interesting discussion about what those things could be. And I offered to the group, and I'm not an expert on this, so I think this is the beginning of a discussion about what that grand challenge, and I would argue just a few grand challenges are. But quantum, in my view, is clearly something that fits this bill. It is one of those rare cases where you are looking at, it's very much more like the Manhattan Project, you are looking at a potential set of technologies that, if mastered, do fundamentally shift the strategic landscape. And being in second place in that effort is not where you want to be. Now, and so in my view, it rises to the level of a major mobilization by the U.S. government to fund and drive those set of issues. It may not be, as the National Quantum Strategy that I recently was looking at, be on a quantum computer, but it may be on a quantum-resistant infrastructure here. It could be on quantum network, communication networks and quantum-resistant cryptography. There's a lot of ways to define what that effort is, but a major focus, successful or not, would still mobilize graduates into these fields. Remember, the moonshot came with the National Security Scholarship Program. It came with a whole set of things that built deep know-how and deep expertise in the country with an at-scale effort. The other thing I would just point out, since, Chris, you mentioned the supply chain risk. One of the most damaging things to supply chain efforts is that whenever you're dealing with a new technology, you're competing with things that are already...
Please press any key to remain in conference. You're
dealing with commodity-based pricing. It's it's almost impossible for a brand-new technology to compete with that. So one of the things really essential to allowing new technologies to come in, and this was certainly true for the internet and many of the communication technologies, the defense early adoption created a place where above commodity pricing was tolerated because it gave you a much higher level of initial performance. And this kind of moonshot, if done at a large enough scale, creates that kind of environment where it is actually cost effective to put very early adoption technology into the stream. If you are waiting till it's all down at commodity pricing, then it's very difficult to not be dealing with global scale production and dealing with all of the concerns of a supply chain risk right away. The other one that I think has some of the characteristics, but maybe not as acutely, are some of these dark web efforts that are happening. I know the Energy Department is looking at this on the energy grid. These are separate, secure networks basically being deployed in pretty serious scale using available dark fiber, but these are, as I understand it, air-gapped and can include things like quantum communication technologies, detection. I think this raises an interesting question about could a major effort in this place really put the government or some important subset of government functions on a separate, more secure basis fundamentally and allow that kind of at-scale deployment. One of the things that I think is most insidious about the cyberspace is the degree, we've never dealt with a technology that's as dual use as this. In almost every other space that the government operates in, you can there's dual use where you use something in one place and then turn it for use over there, certainly the maritime and other assets. But this is fundamentally dual use all the time. We are talking about a space that is commercially viable, and that complete mixing of government and commercial use is one of the most confounding policy tripwires that we always run into in this. And it would strategically change that landscape if, in fact, the government was operating on a separate set, or some portion of it was operating on a separate set of technologies. And so I find that some of those efforts are quite interesting. And with that, I'll see if there's any questions, or if we've used the clock, Chris, you're back on schedule.
Questions from members?
I have a quick question for James. So in running PIT, if the moonshot is adopted by the government as a university, right, a leading university, what would be helpful? What would you like to see happen here, say from a grand challenge perspective, that you would grab hold of as in your actual role with your students and say, okay, that's something that we would be excited about as a university?
Well, it depends on the moonshot. As I said, the Apollo program was as much a public relations and capturing the American spirit move. So that's why that inspiring goal drove a dramatic increase in STEM education. It put more people into universities. It created a surge in science funding. It was the largest increase as a percentage of GDP in our S&T spend that the country has seen. I mean, we've been at sort of at 2.5% of our GDP in terms of how much we put in science and technology. We almost doubled it during the Apollo era, and then it came back down. The way the universities got mobilized was that broad. It brought more people into our programs. Universities grew their engineering programs and aligned against that national calling. The surge in science funding created new opportunities, and of course you saw the growth of the major research-intensive universities that happened through that period, from the 50s through the 70s. So I don't think you actually have to create any new mechanisms for how universities will align, how the national laboratories will align, or how companies will align. But what's missing is that, these do have this national scale. I think that's why they're hard, too. They're also very expensive. We have to be able to make a very strong relative commitment, and I think that's why these have always flowed from a major strategic concern to the United States, and I would argue that cyber has all of those characteristics. The big question we've always faced is, do we realize that now, or do we realize that after something has happened?
John, can I ask you how you noted at the beginning that this is somewhat of a different area, and it seems to me one of the things we've discussed is the striking difference in two ways. One is that both the Moonshot and the Manhattan Project were very much competitions between nation states. And secondly, they were very government-controlled and directed, almost in their entirety. And of course, if you improve the security of the internet, all boats rise, not just your boat. And for the last, 20 or 30 years of internet policy, there's been this recognition that the private sector owns far more of the internet than the government does. So in light of that change dynamic, how do you think about the role of government versus the role of industry in achieving some of these grand challenges?
Well, I think, it's interesting to note that both the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program mobilized industry. In fact, probably the most significant mobilization was to industry. Remember, the National Lab System that eventually became DOE was the U.S. turning to existing R&D labs run by companies and asking if they would set those up on behalf of the government. AT&T Bell Labs set up several of the labs. They operated them for the government for $1. There was a great sense. So I think that these efforts can, very much like we do for large procurement systems or other type, they can directly mobilize industry and should, because that's where a lot of this know-how currently resides. I think that, but I think you raise an important point that we always face this problem of securing the internet we have today versus sort of this leap ahead issue. The government is in a more natural steering position to drive something when you're looking at the leap ahead than when you're looking at the current. And that's why, in my mind, I keep gravitating towards the game changers as ways where the government is just in a much better position to mobilize these kinds of efforts, where you're going to, and the reason is they can essentially underwrite a risk that no company would take. You're looking at an extraordinarily high-risk mobilization, but that as a country, as a gamble we could take, very often, as you're right, in the context of a race, and I would argue both quantum and network segregation have elements of those race underway right now. And it can mobilize and get the companies to participate in a way that would be very hard for the commercial sector to do on its own.
Thank you. Other questions from members?
Yeah, I'll ask one. Patrick, Dave DeWalt here. When I've been in cybersecurity like almost 20 years now, and I've watched a series of what I think of as crises in cyber kind of trigger a pretty heavy response, maybe not all the way to a Sputnik moonshot kind of response that we saw with Apollo and those programs. But when you sort of look back on some of the major threats that we've seen, whether it was a lot of the Chinese IP theft or the Russian election interferences or the Sony North Korean kinds of attacks or, other examples, Iranian DDoS attacks, what do you think it's going to take? I mean, these are pretty significant crises to really put ourselves in position for cyber. We see somewhat responses from those, but you sort of said either before or after a crisis probably triggers that. I'm curious why we haven't seen this already, and what might it take to make.
Well, that might actually explain it. The old story about boiling a frog. You put it in, turn the heat up slow, and it.
Right.
I think that the prevalence of crisis over and over again, and in some ways, NASA had a terminology for that. When they were looking at the Challenger accident, you just renormalize your risk acceptance. And I think, unfortunately, we've kind of renormalized and considered that acceptable normal risk when in fact our dependency on this infrastructure has never been higher, either as a society or as a government. So I think that's one of the pernicious threats here, is that we've kind of renormalized our expectation, and it gets harder to cry wolf and mean it and really mobilize. And that's why I say I worry that we end up not mobilizing until something truly catastrophic does happen, rather than respond. I also think that, there's some analogy here on the public health side. When you're dealing with those things, you can go at symptomatically or disease by disease, and then you can finally get frustrated and then decide we're going to do a war on cancer or war on infection, and mobilize. Those don't happen very often either. And I think there is always going to be a bit of an immune response kind of aspect to cyber because of its very nature, that, that ability to quickly respond to all these new kinds of threats or new technology sets. What we can't do, I think, is construe that as the answer to doing better. But that's where I think the national leadership has to play really a key role in calling us to action.
Thank you. Other questions from NSTAC members? So, thank you, Chancellor. That last exchange was really interesting because, like Dave, I've been in cybersecurity far too long. And when people say, wait till we have a crisis, something will happen, I keep going, we've had tons of crises, and so it's hard to understand why we haven't mobilized, but that explanation was probably the best one I've ever heard. So thank you for that. Okay.
I'm not going to call my project Boil the Frog Project, though.
I think what we'll do now is we'll turn it over to Dave DeWalt to talk about his subcommittee's work, and then after that, we will go into the moonshot at 2 o'clock sharp and have people on the call. Dave?
So I get to talk for 13 minutes?
Yes. You can go longer. Don't go shorter.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. As I mentioned, my name's Dave DeWalt. I'm the founder of a platform called Night Dragon Security, which comes from a famous Chinese attack, ironically. I always said when I founded my next thing, it would come after one of these epiphany crisis moments in cyber, hence the name Night Dragon, which was a big IP theft attack. But I'm formerly the CEO of McAfee, now FireEye, Mandiant. Been around cyber for a long time. I'm now involved with over 20 different cyber security companies. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm chairing a new subcommittee that's all about resiliency of our ICT infrastructure, as well as fostering innovation in that ICT infrastructure, which is very germane in my mind and perhaps very tangential to the moonshot, because it's really around, these two things that are very important. One, can we really create better resiliency of our information communication technology infrastructure? And that's critical for a lot of reasons, because obviously this infrastructure has become, we become very dependent on this infrastructure. We've seen a lot of, shall we say, lost innovation from an America point of view on that infrastructure and that supply chain. Now many of the supply chain components are manufactured or built or operated from companies outside the United States. That can affect, obviously, national security, our emergency preparedness components. So when you start to look at the threats and the vulnerabilities and the potentials here from both resiliency and our ability to really become innovative in this area, again, it's pretty important. So we've been making great progress, really two phases to the subcommittee. The first phase, which really just began very late September, was to identify the risk, to Chris's point, in the componentry of our ICT ecosystem. And from a supply chain point of view, what components have the greatest risk, what components perhaps had already exploits or evasions that have occurred in the past that we can learn from, and identify those areas of infrastructure so that we can create some solutions and improve upon those. We've already had 8 wonderful threat briefings in a short period of time. Some of the most prolific threat intelligence personnel come in to brief us already. So we're making a lot of progress on phase 1. The phase 2 then is to really create a full study related to this with a whole series of solutions and recommendations. But we hope to have a letter prepared for the president by January-ish, and have that all ready to go, and then the full study prepared by the end of March. And we're moving quite forward. So big thank you to a lot of the teams in the room here for a lot of the effort that we've been going through, and we'll be making a very strong cadence almost on a weekly basis towards our goals and our dates. So kind of exciting small moonshot project, but we're on it, an important one nonetheless.
So, thank you. I'm going to open it up to member questions, but I actually have one first, which is, you talked about resiliency in the supply chain, and you do see countries taking a kind of nationalistic approach to the supply chain. They want to rely on domestic product. And at the same time, it's unlikely that any country in the world could produce the entire supply chain necessary to run ICT. So how do you think about that problem, the trade-offs between domestic innovation and need to depend on international products?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott, and I think it's important for us to really study this. And as I mentioned, the first thing that I think we all come to realize is just how complex these supply chains have become. And it sounds like, wow, we have complex supply chains and international commerce, and we've got a lot of dependency on a variety of supply chains, but it's actually very amazing to see how many supply chain vendors. I'm a part of one large Fortune 50 company where I chair safety and security. The number of supply chain vendors is in the thousands for us. And then those components within those supply chain vendors that we have are in the thousands. So you're tens of thousands of permutations of vendors involved with our products and our services. So the enormity of vendors is number one. And then the number of vendors that, shall we say, have very little jurisdiction for security and threats and governance is very high. So the supply chain components that Chris alluded to, perhaps some of the ones that we can identify in the ICT ecosystem are very important. To your point, though, we really have to begin, in my opinion, in earnest, figuring out ways, if we can't build it, how do we test it? And how do we begin to certify our supply chain and our ICT ecosystem components in ways that we can make sure are more secure, more hardened, and we can defend against those? Figuring out ways for us to create certification bodies and articulate mechanisms to the consumers that this enables us to really provide a more safe environment. It's almost like wear your seatbelt. Well, that makes sense. Well, maybe a safety harness would be good too over your shoulder. Okay, that's good. Maybe an airbag would be good too. How do we begin to create a series of articulated security hardening messages for our supply chain and ICT ecosystem in the same way? So I resonate a lot with what Chris alluded to. Was I think the solution is complex too, but having said that, we have to think about what we can do to reinvigorate America in terms of its innovation in this area for manufacturing, and I applaud the administration for that. But then also, if we can't build it, we got to make sure we very thoroughly test it. And that means, getting involved, much like we have with other areas like common criteria testing, other types of cryptography testing that we do, and elevate our game. So I'm looking forward to producing some solutions and hopefully some recommendations in this area.
Great. Questions from other members?
Yeah, Dave, I have a quick question. Is there any, in the briefing so far, any parallels between design and development of weapon systems or key minerals, where we have as a nation said, okay, I think, right? For key weapon systems, we're going to have a source of production, right, in the U.S., or we're going to stockpile certain things. Did that come up at all? As a
Yeah,
concept?
some of that came up. In fact, I thought the 8 briefers we've had so far have been fabulous, one of which is I'm very affectionate to is Mandiant coming in as well, and the Mandiant teams. But we had a variety of different people come in, and I think the enlightening part, again, was A, the complexity, but B, the need to control that supply chain, particularly as you just alluded to, is are real critical components of our infrastructure. And I add on top of that, it's not just a traditional ICT as we perhaps think about it with our telephony and telecommunications infrastructure, but now we also have an internet communication over the top that has changed things in a lot of ways. And its supply chain is very different, and its risk and resiliency is different, as we've seen with recent elections and things like that. So, and they can be weapons as well, particularly through influence. So looking at this from the whole stack and creating some solutions are important. So we're looking at all of that for what we're doing. Thank you.
Other questions from members?
If I could build on a couple, I'm not a member.
Yes, but please, jump in.
A couple points. So on your, if it ain't made here, how do we certify? It's a few things here. It's testing, attestation, certification, but then there's the monitoring mitigation, and then just like, what, a couple of years ago, assume breach, now survive and recover. So it's building resilience into the system. That's my whole point of defend today, secure tomorrow. We're never going to be able to secure everything. How do we, to your point, Mark, identify the stuff that's that critical, high-value assets in federal government parlance, identify what the special considerations or circumstances are for equipment that touches those assets, and then back to, Chancellor, to your point of getting over the commodity pricing hurdle. We've done this before with Trusted Foundry, okay? Why didn't it work? Because we couldn't get to that sweet spot. How do we shift a broader government procurement approach, so it's not just IC or DoD assets, it's everything else? How do we identify what those critical systems are that require a shift in procurement practices away from lowest price technically acceptable to it delivers, and if it fails, it doesn't kill everything else?
Yeah, I'd love to underscore what you're saying because, certainly in my experiences, a point-in-time identification of risk is good, but monitoring the entire process and the entire life cycle is really what's needed. So, we have to understand those components and that infrastructure and that supply chain, but then we have to monitor it over its life cycle. And of course, most of these products today are cloud updated, cloud patched. There's a constant dynamic interaction with these products and infrastructure that we haven't seen before with premise-based and more air-gap solutions. So to your point, Chris, point in time, but then entire life cycle of monitoring is needed too. So good comment.
Well, let me build on that and ask a question of Dave and maybe the Chancellor as well, which is, what is the role of standards in this function, particularly international standards? Like, how do you see, because the supply chain isn't just a U.S. problem, it's certainly U.S. and its allies, but also the whole world has this problem. So how do you think about standards fitting in?
You want to go first or me? I think it's really important. I mean, I'm very passionate about this. Most of you come from the cybersecurity world. It's hard to even name one standard that we've had. And if we look at almost every area of high tech, how do you query a database? Well, you have SQL, you have a language, you do this, you have standards for how we all do it around the world. In the cybersecurity world, we really have almost nothing. In fact, if you look at the antivirus world after my McAfee days, we didn't even build antivirus signatures the same way as a standard. Every vendor did it a little bit differently, everybody deployed it a little bit differently, so standards are really key. And I also think there is some great examples. I alluded to common criteria testing, perhaps FIPS and other types of testing that if we could get at least our allies involved with, I think it would be powerful. If there's a way to create reputational scoring of products that could be something that consumers could really recognize as a valid score, like almost a consumer reported score that has some security, recognition to it, I think that could be very powerful from a security standards point of view. It might be, maybe not an official standard necessarily, but it could be something that consumers could identify. But to your point, Scott, how do we evolve cybersecurity, at least as far as a moonshot and perhaps what I'm doing with the subcommittee, to evolve us to have better standards, better certifications, better hardening, and work together with our federal partners here to do so, I think is a big part of the mission that we would do.
I was just going to, I think the advantage standards have is potentially twofold. One, because the U.S. typically looks to voluntary consensus standards and then aligns to that from a policy perspective, this can move the velocity question. This is something industry can start doing now. The other one is scalability, that because almost all of these industries are global, a strong standards platform can be a basis for global harmonization. So whereas if you start with a regulatory or national approach sometimes, then you have this real problem putting everything together. My own thought on the supply chain side is that, that this is likely in my mind to include both standards around the products themselves and testing and certification of component or system or, but it could very well be that it's on the firms themselves. In other words, this may also have attributes very similar to quality management where, if you're an OEM, you wanted to know that your supplier had certified processes and could run a high integrity operation. So what you look for was ISO 9000 certification to attest that they met all of those criteria. That would actually, I think, be quite effective, because you could look at personnel controls, design and information security within the firm, and other things that sort of go beyond the product itself, but look at the environment in which they're created, and assemble higher reliability supply chain systems by looking at the firms and not just the components.
That process point is an important one. We talked about this a little earlier, which is the IT products aren't static. It's not like they come, they're tested, they're installed and not touched again. They're frequently touched. And so if the process isn't good, you may start with something good but end up with something bad. Right. Other questions? Okay, Dave, thank you, and thank you for the work of the subcommittee. I now want to turn it over to Mark McLaughlin and Peter Altebev to talk about the cybersecurity moonshot.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. My name is Mark McLaughlin from Palo Alto Networks. On behalf of my co-chair of the Cybersecurity Moonshot Subcommittee, Peter, would like you to take the opportunity today to present to you the final report of the President on the Cybersecurity Moonshot. A lot of effort has gone into this. I'll detail a little bit about that as Peter will as well. Before we get to the final deliberation and vote, we wanted to provide an overview of this to the subcommittee of work, as well as the study's key findings and the recommendations that will be made to the President. At its core, the Cybersecurity Moonshot Initiative we advocate for is focused on how U.S. government leadership can catalyze whole-of-nation action to make the Internet more enduringly safe as a generation-defining societal imperative. We adopted the historic model of President Kennedy's original moonshot to underscore our belief that addressing the cybersecurity challenge and its underlying national security, economic, and public safety implications is going to require strategic focus of an audacious outcome, not incremental progress. Since our last NSTAC meeting in May at the White House, we've seen growing consensus about the need for a more unified and extraordinary effort to sustainably address our national cybersecurity challenges, with the term moonshot being increasingly embraced as a synonym for long-term strategic thinking. The final report we present today is a product of over 9 months of intensive research and analysis, leveraging the diverse expertise of NSTAC subcommittee members and nearly 30 external expert briefings, including Chancellor, so thank you for that. In addition to hearing from the renowned cybersecurity experts the NSTAC typically engages, the subcommittee intentionally sought perspectives from outside the cybersecurity domain, especially experts with direct experience in running other moonshot-like efforts that effectively focused and empowered diverse groups of stakeholders to meet the shared grand challenges in areas like space, public health, and biomedicine. The final report is an action plan with an emphasis on specific short-term steps the U.S. government can take now to lead a cybersecurity moonshot initiative by using its unique authorities and capabilities to strategically champion, organize, direct, resource, and empower whole-of-nation activities aligned to shared objectives. Our recommendations intentionally don't prescribe solutions. They seek to establish a process for a cultural mindset shift around cybersecurity, one reoriented from a largely reactive, incremental, and at times defeatist status quo view to a more audacious vision that believes we can boldly assure digital trust, safety, and resilience for all Americans with the right level of national focus, collective resource commitment, and political will. Our overarching message here is simple. Although it may be difficult to visualize and impossible to predict the long-term actions required to realize a fundamentally safe Internet over the course of the next 10 years, this administration can demonstrate leadership by taking specific, short-term actions that produce immediate gains and lay the foundation for a long-term, bolder vision for cybersecurity. Before I turn it over to Peter, I want to thank Scott and Renee for the leadership on this, our government partners, and the untold efforts from the subcommittee members led by Tom Patterson and Sean Morgan. There's just been a great amount of work. I've seen a lot of NSTAC work done. I think this is the best one I've seen, so I really wanted to thank for that, and also to tell the members that if you vote yes, you get one of these little stickers that that Peter was kind enough to have made up. So,
Handed out the stickers.
oh, in that case, you get to keep it if you know. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I want to second Mark's thanks to the broader team, which includes those folks who worked on it, the leadership we got from Renee and Scott, and also all of the briefers. And thank you, Chancellor Gallagher, for being one of those. We do believe that cybersecurity is a national security issue, and we are in danger of being overtaken in critical elements of cybersecurity. The ramifications of this are both negative in terms of real tangible harm to both our security and our economy, and also the lack of the positive attributes that would come from the growth you get from leadership in cyberspace. So we do think this arises to one of those moonshot elements. For the moonshot that Mark just described to be successful, the final report focuses on 3 areas. And we do get into real specifics. This is a roadmap. And the areas are governance, strategic framework and pillars, and grand challenges. So I'll go through each of those briefly. The governance section is focused on how the Cybersecurity Moonshot Initiative is announced, operationalized, and managed. And with respect to the announcement, we believe that a presidential or vice presidential level of focus is necessary to effectively convey that we have to sustainably address the cybersecurity activity, and that activity is a collective action. Finally, that in order to be successful, the result of that success will be the continuation of our long-term economic security and prosperity. The report recommends the creation of a Cybersecurity Moonshot Council, chaired by the President or Vice President, to strategically lead and oversee the initiative. The council will be comprised of cabinet-level ministers and include private sector and academic leaders. The council's exclusive focus would be on long-term, outcome-based strategic planning, distinct from the important and necessary cybersecurity work happening all across the U.S. government that naturally must balance more immediate and reactive cybersecurity needs. And finally, the report emphasizes the important role of department-level work to drive the Council's objectives, specifically highlighting the Department of Homeland Security's new National Risk Management Sector, which we think is completely aligned to the cybersecurity moonshot principles. And Secretary Krebs, thank you for the discussion earlier. The 2 teams have worked very, very closely in developing this plan, and we really look forward to the continuing work that the CISA will be putting out after Friday. The second element is on the strategic framework and pillars. And here, we really focused on 6 broad categories of activity, where the NSTAC believes whole-of-nation action must be organized in pursuit of realizing a safe internet. It's very interesting. When you go from looking at the next 3 months to the next 6 months, and you go out to looking at 10 years, all of a sudden your choices open up. All of a sudden your tools open up. And you can look beyond specific technology and say, how do we really become more effective at protecting the internet? So when we did that, we recognized 6 strategic pillars. And those pillars are technology, education, human behavior, policy, privacy, and ecosystem, or the interaction between those pillars. The pillars underscore another key finding of the NSTAC report, that as a nation, we need to inspire and leverage multidisciplinary expertise to this challenge, injecting new ideas and approaches beyond the traditional cybersecurity community. It was very interesting when we had briefers from, academia who really understand human behavior the way almost nobody else does. Speaking to people who have lived their life in cybersecurity, kind of magic happened. And one of the great things of this moonshot was bringing those people together. And finally, the third element of the moonshot is around grand challenges. Chancellor, you mentioned that. We believe that cybersecurity is a complex problem, and the report recognizes that meaningful progress will require both the incentivization of existing and known solutions and the pursuit of new transformational solutions. The report, however, predominantly focuses on the pursuit of transformational efforts. And the purpose of that is to fundamentally alter the current trajectory of internet safety and security. The report advocates for a grand challenge approach to address the critical areas where the current pace of innovation is not sufficient. Specifically, the report recommends that the U.S. government initiate multi-stakeholder processes to identify, scope, and launch these grand challenges. We've identified several areas that we think would be ripe for that. Even though artificial intelligence is becoming a more mature technology, where artificial intelligence actually goes is uncertain. And we think that a grand challenge would be one of the things that ought to be considered around the ultimate deliverables there. And more to your point, Chancellor, quantum computing, which we think is probably the most ripe element for a grand challenge, and biometrics as well. So let me close by reiterating a core belief of the subcommittee. And this was one of the first items that I think Mark, when he really kind of gave life to the moonshot, emphasized among all of us. And that was that this final report needed to be seen as the start of the process and not the end. And I remember in the beginning, Mark saying that this had to be a national dialogue. And this has to be a dialogue that embraces the bold pursuit of big ideas in cybersecurity. And that we can't continue just relying on incrementalism. And we also can't afford to fail. Another key element of a moonshot. So with that, thank you very much. And Scott, we'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to open the floor for any comments or questions from NSTAC members or our government partners. This time you're actually allowed to speak before we proceed to a vote. Any questions from members or government? Okay. Here,
I was going to ask one if you want. I thought the
The
governance
conference
side
is no
was-
longer in lecture mode.
We need to vote. I thought the governance side was really awesome in the Cyber Moonshot Council concept, and you talked a little bit about industry kind of coming together with council. What do you envision for some of the industry representations there? Is there certain sectors that you really think are most attractive to helping with the long term?
Yeah, I think actually the NSTAC might be a good example of that, which has evolved over time as well. If we look around this table and say who's represented here, and if we looked at it 5 years ago, it was very different, and maybe it'll be very different in 5 years. I think you have to kind of roll with the punches, from a technical perspective and critical infrastructure perspective. So I would, I think we take a snapshot today and then also try to see where the puck's going to be. But everybody, it's everybody's dependent on the digital technologies today in every industry. Obviously, the critical infrastructure ones, financial, electric, all those I think should be represented, as well as folks from cyber as well. But it's hard to say in 5 years what that might be.
Right, exactly, that's what I was thinking.
And one of the things, Dave, that I would add is we really focused a lot on the multidisciplinary element of this, that it is not only about technology, it's about privacy, it's about education, it's about policy, it's about human behavior. One of the ways to show the reality of that is to make sure that that council has expertise that goes beyond just the technical. So that's ultimately going to be up to the president and the vice president, but we think there are ways to really get the whole of nation behind this.
other questions or comments?
Yep. Scott, Mark's point, I think, is spot on. It's, beyond this group, who are the validators of the concept, who can, who are your customers that can add their perspectives from consuming products, consuming and experience these issues firsthand on their network. So I think, one of the things we need to work through is bringing the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, the NIAC, into the fold, having a joint NSTAC-NIAC view. I think that would be useful, particularly as we go forward, as this goes up to the president. Peter, your point about incrementalism really resonated with me. I think when we work through the boiling the frog problem, in part, we haven't had within any of those pillars or verticals, we haven't had that really shockwave event. Maybe we have, we just need to tune to the wavelength a little bit better. But, when you look across those pillars, or when you look across the incremental events and you put them all together and you aggregate, then you get to, we've had those moments that should have gotten us to the Sputnik moment or the Apollo initiative. And it's just, again, I think it's dialing into the wavelength a little bit better and really finding who those champions are that are going to lead events like this.
Other questions or comments? Okay, hearing no further comments, I would like to make a motion to approve the report so that it can be sent to the president for review and consideration. May I have a second?
Second.
Any opposed? Hearing none, thank you. The motion is carried. I want to take a moment to thank Peter, Mark, and the subcommittee for absolutely tremendous work. I am struck by this vote representing both the finish line and the starting line. And we seem to have hit both at the same time, but it's terrific work, so thank you all for your effort. Okay, at this time, I'd like to invite Mr. Schneider to make any closing comments. Grant?
Just a couple, Scott, thank you very much. I want to add my thanks to Mark and Peter, and perhaps more to Tom and Sean, who probably did a lot of the heavy lifting on this effort, and to everyone else that participated. Chancellor Gallagher, thank you for helping the Moonshot team, but also being here with us today to help inform this discussion. Scott, I think your point on this is the starting line is really important. We tend to, and I think in the government, we often measure success by the date something is signed. We put neat numbers on it, and then we talk in numbers so no one else knows what we're talking about in the government, whether it's executive orders or presidential directives or other things. But it really is, and all of those, and this is certainly a case where this is a starting point for going forward. So I would ask that the committee continue to hold us accountable to how are we implementing, how are we actually driving success for this. I think part of that, Dave, comes to your study, which is sort of a first, potentially a first implementation along the lines of what we're trying to do with the Moonshot, as well as the efforts we have underway nationally from our cyber strategy, from DHS's strategy, and the work that Chris will continue to do under CISA going forward. So thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone for being here today. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant. Mr. Krebs, any closing remarks?
Just to say, again, thank you to the group. I hate to say this, though, the easy part's over.
That was easy?
That was the easy part. The hard part's ahead of us. Whatever we do, whatever manifests for results from this report, it's going to take a lot of hard work. We're going to have to break things. We're going to have to challenge a lot of those assumptions and get out of our comfort zones to achieve the outcomes you've laid out here. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this meeting, which was, I think, both informative, interesting, and productive. A special thanks to our government partners, Grant and Chris, for their insights. I would also like to thank Chancellor Gallagher for joining us and his remarks. Our next meeting will be a conference call on January 11th, 2019. During this meeting, we will deliberate and vote on the NSTAC letter to the President on advancing resiliency and fostering innovation in the ICT ecosystem. Not to put too much pressure on Dave, but there's your date. Additionally, we are planning to hold a joint meeting with the National Infrastructure Advisory Council in February of 2019. This meeting will be held outside of the National Capital Region. More information about the meeting, including the meeting date and location, will be forthcoming. Does anyone have any additional comments they would like to offer? Hearing none, I'd like to thank everyone. I would like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting. May I have a second?
Second.
Any opposed? Thank you. The meeting is now adjourned.